over the past decade, it seemed to me anyway that something much more than political disagreement, I mean, has been unfolding in public life. Yeah, like beneath the arguments about policy and culture and whatnot, there's a deeper current, like a psychological current or a psycho-spiritual type of current. It's hard to put a word in it, but it doesn't always show up, you see, in the headlines, but you can feel it, and I'm not the only one, you know. In periods of rapid change and social strain, people don't just look for better arguments, they look for orientation. They look for language that helps them situate themselves in a world that feels increasingly unstable. Now, under those conditions, certain figures begin to occupy roles that exceed their formal expertise. Their ideas are not simply debated or leaned on, like the arguments and positions they put forth are not just evaluated; they're inhabited. Almost. And for me, like something like this became visible in the cultural reception of Jordan Peterson. Now, this isn't to suggest that Peterson consciously, stepped into any grand symbolic role beyond that of psychologist or lecturer. But it isn't to suggest that he didn't either. And it isn't to claim insight into his private intentions. But as his audience grew, the language surrounding the man shifted in very, very subtle ways, at least to my mind. Peterson's work drew deeply from symbolic categories: responsibility, yeah, sacrifice, meaning, order, and chaos. Now, these aren't just abstract ideas inside academic psychology. They're patterns that have long functioned within mythic and religious traditions, and because of that, they carry real psychological and spiritual weight. People did not simply find the arguments persuasive, is what I'm getting at. Many experienced them as orienting, you know, many as stabilizing, as restoring coherence in them. Now, you know, and moreover, like this symbolic orientation wasn't incidental to his work. That's important. Like one of the core underpinnings here of Peterson's intellectual architecture was Jungian depth psychology. He repeatedly acknowledged Carl Jung's influence, especially the idea that myths and archetypes are not primitive leftovers from the past, but structuring forces within the human psyche. So, when I speak here about archetypal activation in relation to his public role, I'm not importing a framework from outside. I'm remaining within one of the psychological traditions that informed his own thinking. So that's important. And from within that tradition, like from where I'm sitting, something becomes clearer. What do I mean? Okay, so the activation of archetypal or mythic material, yeah, is not a neutral cognitive event. It does not occur safely within the bounds of abstract reasoning. In Jungian psychology, the encounter with archetypal content, whether through dreams, art, religion, or public discourse, carries with it the potential for what Jung called inflation. Now, inflation in this sense doesn't simply mean arrogance or ego expansion, but it can mean that also. But more importantly, and more fundamentally, it refers to a more subtle identification with an archetypal role or function. That's to say, the quiet merging, if you like, of the personal self with a transpersonal pattern. A person can begin often without noticing to carry more psychic material than their existing personality structure can comfortably metabolize. Jung repeatedly emphasized the necessity of integration, especially shadow integration, when engaging with symbolic forces. Without grounding, without embodied life, without the slow work of integration, archetypal energies can overwhelm the individual psyche. They can constellate forces that are simply too large to be safely held by cognition alone. And let's face it here, Cognition, after all, was Peterson's primary tool. So there can be a real big difference between understanding symbol and being transformed by it. The psyche resists being turned into an object of explanation. It insists on participation, on lived integration. When mythic pressure begins to concentrate around a person in public life, even if they never consciously seek that role, the field itself can exert force. Expectations accumulate, projections circulate, and the individual becomes a focal point for meaning, belonging, and direction. Variations of this pattern can be observed right across political leadership, and religious movements as well, particularly religious revival movements, activist communities, and even artistic subcultures. Whenever symbolic language gathers around a figure in times of instability, the psychological field intensifies, and with it, the pressure placed upon those at its centre. Now, carrying that kind of pressure is not merely an intellectual task. It involves ongoing psychological work that isn't visible on a lecture stage or in a debate clip. It requires integration at a pace that public life rarely allows. In recent years, Peterson, has spoken openly about his struggles with illness and dependency, addiction, quite frankly. Although he doesn't put it like that. Now it would be careless, like, and unfair for me to reduce such experiences here to a single explanatory story. That's not what I'm doing. Human vulnerability is never ever that simple. And yet, where I'm looking from, it seems it seems very, very plausible. That occupying a highly activated symbolic position places unusual strain on the organism at its center, if you like. The attempt to hold together large cultural anxieties through analysis alone can become an immense burden over time. And correspondingly, it could be that what we may have witnessed was not simply the rise and destabilization of an individual thinker, but the pressure that builds when mythic language re enters public life faster than it can be personally integrated. Now, that question feels really worth sitting with, for me anyway. And not just in relation to Peterson, but in relation to anybody attempting to speak meaning, identity, and belonging into a psychologically destabilized cultural moment. So within the broader Icarus Landing project here, this tension returns again and again. The movement towards symbolic or mythic language is not in itself a regression into fantasy. In some cases, it may represent a mature return to image and story after the limits of abstraction have been reached. But such a return requires integration. Logos alone cannot contain mythos, and mythos without integration can overwhelm logos. And so, if we are entering into a cultural period in which archetypal language is resurfacing in public discourse, and it certainly appears that way, then the deeper task may not to be suppressed, nor to romanticize it, but to learn how to metabolize it without collapsing into it. That seems to me is not only a question for public figures, it's a question for all of us.